Today we're going to be talking about Rome. Again, we're going to talk about the transition of Rome from its republic, its early government, government by, for, and of the people, a government that was very influential on the makers of the American system of government, and we'll see how that government fared from crisis to crisis in ancient Rome. We'll see how different factions within the Roman body politic shaped that government, and then we'll see what happens to that government at the end as it is usurped by powerful men like Julius Caesar, Pompey the Great, and Octavian Augustus, the first Roman emperor, a man named Octavian, who would go on to be called Augustus, and we'll see how that empire forms today. It's a complicated story. It involves a lot of individuals, but we'll take our time and we'll go through each of these persons and what they do individually and how it shapes Roman culture and society. We're also going to see quite a few examples of Roman art and architecture today as examples of what was being done in these various periods. So be on the lookout for those. When we last left off, though, we were talking about the origins of Rome and where the Romans believed that they came from. And we ended talking about the story of Aeneas and those Trojan refugees as they sought shelter in a new homeland in Italy. We also looked at the reality of what Rome was really like at its beginnings, these simple little mud huts on a hill. And that's what today is going to be about, how this civilization, this culture, this society goes from being mud huts on a hill, a little village that controls some salt flats and a river crossing, to a city that would be known as the mother of the world, a city that, pictured here in the 3rd century, 3rd century AD, I should say, is a city that would be the home of over 1 million people, a city that would be host to some of the great monuments of the ancient world, and a city that still captures our imaginations today. How did that happen? Well, first and foremost, one of the ways that Rome was transformed from mud huts on a hill to a city that is the center of the ancient world was through a very kind of quotidian, maybe surprising way, maybe a way that we wouldn't expect. And that is sewer drains. You can't have a city of 1 million people without a functioning sewer system. Well, you can, it's just remarkably unpleasant. And in Rome, those mud huts on a hill were situated in a swamp. And when the Romans built this sewer, the sewer that they called the Cloaca Maxima, that just means the biggest drain pipe. When they built their Cloaca Maxima, their sewer system, around the 6th century BC, it allowed them to drain those swamps, which were very unhealthy places, full of mosquitoes and malaria. When they drained those swamps, they allowed people to live not just on top of the hills, but between them. And that caused that city to grow. By the beginning of what we know as the Roman Republic in the 5th century, Rome is a city where the main part of civic life occurs not on top of the hills where people are living, those old neighborhoods on top of the hills, but between them in these meeting places and markets that the Romans called forums. These forums were the heart of this ancient city. That's where politics happened, that's where business happened, and often, increasingly, that's where many of the religious rituals of the city were held. We find temples in these places, grand public buildings. In fact, the Roman Forum is still today one of the highlights of the ancient city. So what happens in a Roman Forum? What happens in the ancient city of Rome before it's an empire? What is its government like? How do these people organize themselves? The Roman government is one that we might recognize. It's one that we might find familiar if we lived underneath it. It's one that is not maybe so dissimilar from our own here in the United States. And that's because the founders of the United States were big fans of ancient history. John Adams, for example, was a Latin teacher. He knew his Roman history well. Thomas Jefferson, the architect of the Declaration of Independence, he was very well read in Greek and Roman history. And men like James Madison, who would write the Constitution, and George Washington, who would be the first president of the United States, they too were big fans of the Romans. And what they did is they saw in their revolution against the British monarchy and the overthrow of that foreign British rule over the American colonies, they saw in that a continuation of the Roman rebellion against their own kings. Like Americans, Romans distrust authority. They distrust especially the authority of kings, those who would call themselves your monarch, those who would say that they are better than you just because of the accident of their birth. And the Romans especially distrusted the kings of Rome in the 7th and 6th century BC. These were not Roman kings. They were foreign kings. They were Etruscans. If you remember the Etruscans, they were the people to the north of Rome, and they had installed their own kings over the city. By the 5th century BC, the Romans had overthrown those kings in a revolution and won a war, a rebellion against the Etruscans. And the government they founded in place of the Etruscan kings was a government that was unlike many others in the ancient world. It drew some inspiration from the Athenian democracy, but itself was something wholly new and very different. The Romans called their new government the res publica. What that literally means is the public thing. The thing owned by all. Right? It is best translated as either republic, is how it's most commonly translated today, but maybe an even better translation of it is commonwealth. The wealth, the possessions held by all citizens in common. That is really what the res publica of Rome was. It was all the things that all the citizens of Rome each owned in turn, what each of them could claim all together. That included the public land, that included the public wealth, that included public buildings. And their government was the organization of that society and how it would treat the things that were good for everyone. That is at the heart of what a republic is and should be. The social and collective care of the whole society, the whole body of citizens. In the Roman Republic, the Romans were divided. Right? They were the citizens of the Roman Republic, all Romans, were divided into two classes. One was an aristocracy, the wealthy, the powerful, and the other were the poor, the unemployed, those who could claim citizenship but maybe were certainly not wealthy. The aristocracy of Rome held the most power. This Republic of Rome, this Roman Republic, was never an equal opportunity government. It was a government that was always controlled by the wealthy and the powerful first. The poorer citizens of Rome often tried to claim some more power. And the story of the Roman Republic and the struggle for equality and the struggle for the power of working Romans is a long one, and one that we don't have really a lot of time to talk about. I wish we did. But suffice to say, we can see in the Roman Republic a division between the rich and the poor. There was an aristocracy, a class of rich citizens that called themselves patricians. And that literally means the city fathers, fathers of the country. It's a very maybe arrogant way of describing yourself if you're the ruling class. The fathers of the country. And they are a small minority, and a small minority of families could claim to be patricians. Citizens of the lower classes, the poor, were called plebeians, the plebs, and they make up the vast majority of the citizen body. The most powerful political unit in Rome, the most powerful governing body in the Roman Republic, was the Senate. And the Senate just means old men, gathering of old men. It's the council of elders, right? The Roman Senate. And to be in the Roman Senate, you had to be from a patrician family. At most, there were ever only about 500 members of the Roman Senate, which outnumbers our Senate, which is only 100 members, by quite a bit. But there were only ever about 500 or so members of the Roman Senate, and they all came from the most powerful families. To be a member of the Roman Senate, you had to have won an election for a high office. And after your term as a magistrate or a judge or like a mayor, a consul of the city, after that was done, then you entered the Roman Senate. The plebeians, on the other hand, they had many different kinds of assemblies, public assemblies, where they could go and have a vote. The largest of them, maybe the most important of them, depending on the period, was called the Council of the Plebs, the Concilium Plebis. This was a place where, like in Athens, where all citizens had a voice and all citizens had a vote. They were the ones who made and decided legislation. The Romans also have a kind of constitution. They called it the 12 Tables. These were the earliest laws of the Roman Republic. They were probably inspired by Greek law codes, but what they're there for is to serve as kind of regulation for how citizens could interact with one another and who got to control what part of the public wealth, right? The Republic, the Commonwealth. They also do things like the 12 Tables decide if patricians and plebeians can intermarry. And, well, no. For the most part, the 12 Tables forbids that. There will be laws passed later on after plebeians agitate that say that, yeah, well, maybe, okay, we're gonna change the 12 Tables law, and patricians and plebeians can intermarry. But that takes quite a long time. For the most part, the plebeians are locked out of the really higher rungs of society. No matter if they win a lot of wealth, right? They're always going to be second-class citizens because they're not members of these very old, very powerful families. The Roman Republic also elects a number of magistrates. You don't get elected to the representative government bodies, right? Not like we do. We elect our representatives to go to Washington, and there they'll vote for us, for our interests, presumably. Not always. In the Roman government, you don't elect people to go to the Senate. You don't elect people to go to the Council of the Plebs. Instead, you elect magistrates and officers that run the city. These public elections included elections of a consul, and the consul, think of the consul like a Roman president or a mayor of the city. And a consul is not elected alone. And the Romans would elect two of them at once. It's sort of like if we elected a president and a vice president, but they were both equal in power, and they could both veto each other, they could forbid each other's legislation, and they could both act as a check and a balance on the other. Right? And they were only elected for 1 year. And once you're a consul, you can never be consul again. That is at least how it starts. That's going to be changed later on by men like Julius Caesar. Excuse me. These two annually elected consuls, right? They are both leaders in the city, but also they are the military commanders. Other magistrates and officers elected were judges. They were caretakers of the city. They were men responsible for organizing the budget. Right? There are lots of different offices in the Roman Republic, and each of them was fairly competitive to try and get one of these elections. And since there are only 2 consuls every year, that was the most hotly contested election. For the most part, the Senate controls things like foreign policy. The Senate of Rome was made up of former elected office holders, and they hold a position in the Senate for life, or until they lose the amount of money necessary to call themselves a senator. The Senate controls things like the city's finances. They advise on new legislation, but they don't vote on legislation. The Council of the Plebs votes on it. They write new legislation. They tell elected officials what to do. And when Rome grows beyond the borders of the city itself in Italy, the Senate is responsible for managing all those provinces outside of the city's direct control. By the end of the 3rd century BC, Rome had expanded its control over most of the Italian peninsula, as well as the large islands off the Italian coast, Corsica, Sardinia, and Sicily. It was a republic that controlled not only a city, but increasingly a larger and larger region in the Mediterranean. It had a great rival, and that rival lay across the sea at Carthage. Carthage was an old Phoenician colony. If you remember the Phoenicians, back when we were talking about the Greeks, it was the Phoenicians who brought the alphabet to the Mediterranean. It was the Phoenicians who reconnect the Mediterranean after the Bronze Age. And one of their colonies grew and grew and grew and became a capital on its own right, a place called Carthage, that ruled over what you're seeing in this map here, ruled over all the territory in purple. This was the Carthaginian Republic. It was an oligarchic republic, a republic where only the wealthy really had power. It was a republic that was also focused on trading and merchants and shipbuilding and sailing. They were a powerful naval power, whereas Rome was a land-based power. The Carthaginians became Rome's great rival, and by the second, and then in the even continuing on into the early 1st century, I suppose, we see that Carthage, pictured here in this reconstruction of Carthage in a much later period, we see Carthage not only as a rival to Rome, but as its great enemy. Arguably the first world war of the ancient world, a war that spanned the entirety of the ancient world, occurred between Carthage and Rome, beginning in the year 218 BC. This was a war fought by a great African leader, a Carthaginian general named Hannibal Barca, who led a daring invasion of Italy, crossing the Alps with tens of thousands of men and elephants, crossing a mountain range in the midst of winter to surprise and invade Roman Italy, caught the Romans entirely off guard, and over the next almost 20 years, the Romans would fight Hannibal and Carthage. It was a tremendous conflict that consumed most of the ancient world in it. And by the end, Rome, surprisingly, comes out victorious. Through some tactical shenanigans and strategic maneuvers, the Romans are able to best Carthage. They don't really beat Hannibal, although he's defeated finally at a place called Zama in North Africa. But Hannibal hangs on for a long time, undefeated. The Romans finally beat Hannibal and beat the Carthaginians after about 20 years of warfare. It's a whole generation raised with knowing nothing but war. And this conflict is going to shape Rome and its republic afterwards. By the beginning of the 2nd century BC and the end of that conflict in 201, Rome is now the capital not just of Italy and this growing Roman Republic in Italy, which is really just a mishmash of different alliances with different people in Italy. But now Rome controls former territories of Carthage across the sea, and within a century, those territories are going to expand to include Greece, part of Turkey, and large parts of North Africa, and even Spain and Portugal. And they're going to make inroads into France as well. That's what's Gaul up on that map. The Roman Republic would be an empire long before it has an emperor. The Roman Republic would rule an empire. That Roman Republic, following the war with Carthage, that Roman Republic was divided it has really two political factions. And at first you might think, oh, these political factions, they map themselves on to that distinction between rich and poor, the patricians and plebeians in ancient Rome. But that is not entirely true. The Romans have these two political factions, and then surprisingly, many times, members of the patricians might be members of sorry, my dogs have just come in. They are not leaving the room while I'm trying to record. Apologies, guys. Okay, they're gone. At least they didn't start barking, huh? The Roman politics is divided into two factions. The optimates, who believe that the Senate should have the most power in the city, and that they are traditionalists. They believe in that Roman constitution, and often they're made up of the old families, the aristocracy, the patricians, but not always. Maybe the most famous of the optimates was a plebeian. He was a man named Pompey the Great, Pompey Magnus. He was a plebeian who had risen through the ranks of the Roman military, even been elected consul, and he was a staunch supporter of traditional Roman government. The optimates are most concerned with those who might seek power for themselves, those who would use the Roman people as pawns in schemes to claim individual power. Right? The optimates are worried that someone wants to be a king. Contrasting them were a group that were called the populares. The populares were often made up of plebeians, or sometimes even members of that patrician aristocracy. One famous example of a popularis is Julius Caesar. He was a member of the patrician aristocracy, in fact, a member of one of the oldest families in Rome, the Julius family. That family could trace its ancestry back all the way to Aeneas. And Julius Caesar was not an optimate. He was a patrician popular. He believed, like many of the populares believed, that power in Rome should be held by the people, that the plebeian assemblies should have the most political authority, that they should be the ones making decisions for themselves, that Rome should be a far more democratic place rather than an oligarchic place. Oftentimes these populares are, like Caesar, are criticized, that they only want to help the plebeians in order to further their own personal power. Caesar was people were constantly claiming that he wanted to be the king of Rome. He, of course, always said, no, I merely want to restore the Roman Republic for the people. Who do we believe? That's a good question. The Romans often don't know who to believe either. Caesar, and this is one of our few portraits of Caesar here on the right. Caesar was born to that old and influential Julii family, the Julius family. He was, for better or worse, born to a family that had fallen on difficult times. Yes, they had an amazing name, but they were poor. They had lost much of their wealth. And if Caesar wanted a political career, he was going to have to borrow money. And he does. For the first 40 years of his life, Caesar is a nobody. I mean, he's a member of the Roman aristocracy, he's involved in government, but it's not until really he's elected consul, right, that president of Rome in the year 59, that Caesar becomes an important player, a really important player in Roman politics. But to get to that level, to become consul, Caesar had gone deeply into debt. He owed vast sums of money that he had used to pay for his political campaigns. And now, he doesn't just owe that money back. He owes favors to powerful men all over the city that he had used. Right? He had used their influence to get elected. In the year, as soon as he is elected consul, Caesar has a plan. He is going to pay off his debts, not through corruption schemes of like so many other Roman politicians. One famous Roman politician, a man named Crassus, he was the richest man in Rome, and the way he made his money was by building Rome's first fire department, but also, we think, by committing arson. So he would have some of his men go out and set your house on fire, and then his fire truck would show up and offer to put the fire out in your house if you sold him your house at cheap prices. And then once he had bought up all these properties in Rome, Crassus built he built a construction company, and he built cheap apartments. He was like a landlord and really a slumlord, a landlord and a arsonist / fire department. He's a total swindler. And this is who's powerful in Roman politics. In fact, Crassus was one of the men who loaned Caesar money. Caesar owes these guys money. But Caesar doesn't want to use that kind of method. That harms the Roman people, he says. He doesn't want to use that kind of method to make his fortune, to pay back his debts. Instead, Caesar says he is going to pay back his debts by conquering one of Rome's enemies. He is going to take the army that this consul could lead and take it to France and conquer territory and take slaves and bring wealth and land to the people of Rome. And so he does. But this is a war that Caesar has decided to wage all on his own. It does not have the approval of the Roman Senate. It was, many of Caesar's enemies said, an illegal war. It was a war that the Roman Senate had never, ever sanctioned. Caesar claimed, though, that this war was going to help the people of Rome. It was going to give them the resources they need, the land that they needed. It's going to bring wealth to the city. Right? The wealth was, of course, coming from the people of France, the Gauls, that Caesar was conquering, enslaving. He was taking their land and their stuff, looting their cities, their treasuries, and that was what was enriching him, but also, he says, the people of Rome. The Roman people loved him. They adored Caesar. Whenever he would conquer territory, he would give the land to his soldiers to build farms and homes on. He would give them slaves of the conquered Gauls. He enriched himself and the Roman people. But the Senate hated him for it. They hated him because he was fighting a war without the sanction of the Senate. He was fighting a war that was popular among the populares, but was hated by the optimates, who saw in Caesar a man who was just trying to make himself into a king. Eventually, Caesar was recalled to Rome, and the Senate planned to put him on trial. Caesar says, okay, I'll return to Rome. But when he does, he returns at the head of his army. His soldiers remained loyal. The Senate was counting on that Roman army to turn against Caesar, but it didn't. The Roman army and its commanders stayed loyal to Caesar. When Caesar returned to Italy, he camped north of Rome at a place called the Rubicon River. And the soldiers went into winter camp. And in the city of Rome, the optimates panicked. Many of them fled the city. Others tried to raise an army to fight Caesar. Their champion, Pompey the Great, for example, said, all I have to do is stamp my foot, and legions will rise up to fight Caesar. And it was true. The optimates had many supporters. But what Caesar did, by bringing his army all the way back to Italy and camping north of the Rubicon, he was signaling that he was ready for civil war. And the Senate of Rome was too. When the winter ended, Caesar crossed the Rubicon, and that's become a popular moment in our shared culture even today. Crossing the Rubicon means taking a chance. And Caesar says as he crosses the river, alia iacta est. The die is cast. The dice are rolled because he doesn't know how this civil war is going to turn out. And Caesar, his army, and Pompey and the Senate and their army, they would fight this civil war for control of the Republic. They would fight this civil war for years. Fighting would happen, yes, in Italy, but also in those foreign territories of the Roman Republic, in Spain, North Africa, Egypt, and finally, it would be decided at a dusty place in Greece called Pharsalus. At Pharsalus, Caesar's army beat Pompey's army. Pompey fled and was eventually murdered by the Pharaoh of Egypt. That's a whole other story. A good one, but a whole other story. And Caesar was named dictator for life. Dictator for the Romans is not the same as dictator for us. We say dictator, we mean an autocratic ruler. But when the Romans have a dictator, that's an elected official. Usually a dictator is someone whose word is law, and they're elected in times of crisis to solve a serious problem that threatens the whole society. Julius Caesar is elected dictator, but he says, I'm not elected dictator for just one term of office. And usually when a dictator in Rome is elected, it's elected for only 6 months. Caesar says, I am dictator not for 6 months, I am dictator for life. For many, this was confirmation that what Caesar really wanted was not to restore the Republic, but to overthrow it, to become a king. For Caesar and his supporters, though, well, they said that Caesar does not want to be king. No, he just needs more than 6 months to restore the Republic to working order, to help the people of Rome. I can't tell you which is the truth. I can't tell you if Caesar was ambitious and wanted to be dictator for life, just to be a king by another name. I can't tell you if Caesar's real goal was to restore the Roman Republic. We simply don't know. By the year 44 BC, Caesar, dictator for life now, is planning and plotting what he will do in the Republic of Rome. We're told he has a whole filing cabinet full of plans. That he plans on expanding the Republic's territory in the east through foreign wars again. That he plans on overhauling how the Senate functions. That he plans on giving more power to the Concilium Plebis, the Council of the Plebeians. We don't really know his plans, because in the year 44 BC, there is a conspiracy. The surviving enemies of Caesar, the Optimates, are conspiring to kill him. And on March 15th, called the Ides of March, that just means the middle of March. On the Ides of March, March 15th, not too long ago actually, Caesar was called down to the Senate to give them an address. He was going to tell the Senate his plans for the Republic on March 15th. Now the Senate usually met in a place called the Curia, but that had been burned down in the Civil War. So it is a point of irony that the Senate was meeting not in the Curia, which actually Caesar was rebuilding, and it will have his name. The Senate House will have his name forevermore. Now today it's called the Curia Julia, the Senate House of Julius. But they couldn't meet there. The new version wasn't finished being built, and the old version had been burned down in the Civil War by Caesar. Instead, the Senate was meeting in the theater built by Caesar's rival Pompey. And on that day, March 15th, that Caesar is going to the theater of Pompey, first his wife warns him that she's had a terrible dream, that he shouldn't go. He ignores it. As he's walking down there, an old woman tells him to beware the Ides of March, right? And usually if an old lady approaches you and says, hey, something terrible's going to happen, and she's like all creepy looking, you should probably pay attention, right? That's just good sense. But Caesar ignored her too. And when he got to the meeting of the Senate, he was surrounded by senators, all of them asking him for his attention, for his help. But that was just a ruse. It was a plot, right? That was all that they were just trying to get his attention, get him away from any of his supporters. And on a secret signal, those conspirators, including men named Cassius and Brutus, who was basically raised by Caesar. He was not Caesar's son, although he might have been in reality Caesar's illegitimate son. But Brutus, who had known Caesar his whole life, Caesar was basically his godfather. These conspirators drew their daggers and they stabbed Caesar again and again. And as Caesar lay bleeding on the floor of the theater built by Pompey, he stared up at the statue of Pompey there, and then he looked at the face of Brutus, and he says, not what we're told by Julius Shakespeare, that Caesar's last words are, and you too, Brutus, et tu, Brute, and you too, Brutus. No, what Caesar's contemporaries say his last words were not even in Latin, they were in Greek. Caesar looks at Brutus and he says, and you, my child? Ah, what drama. Caesar may be revealing on the moment of his death that Brutus is his illegitimate son, and Brutus never knew it until after he had stabbed him. Ah, you could write a book about this. No one would believe it, but it's true. Caesar dies in the floor of the theater of Pompey, and with his death, there is a vacuum. No one knows who is in charge. Into that power vacuum step two men. One is Caesar's adopted son, Gaius Julius Octavianus. We'll just call him Octavian. His second in command also steps forward. These two are going to be rivals. Octavian, Caesar's nephew and adopted son, and Caesar's second in command, Marcus Antonius. Together, they will first fight a war against the Optimates. They will defeat them, but it takes time. When finally Caesar's murderers are defeated, another civil war, the two, Octavian and Marcus Antonius, will themselves become rivals for control. On the right, you see a coin. This is an old Roman coin. Here's a close-up of it. This Roman coin was minted by the conspirators who killed Caesar. And you can see at the bottom of it the date, Ides Marti, Ide Mar. That's an abbreviation for the middle of March. On the coin, too, are two daggers. These are pictures of the knives that killed Caesar. And in the middle of it, there's a little cap. That's a freedman's cap. That's a cap that would be worn by a slave who had been given his freedom. And that's what this coin is saying, that those who killed Caesar had won their freedom from slavery to a tyrant. Right? That Caesar was wanting to be a tyrant king, and they had killed him to preserve their freedom as Roman citizens. Many people did not agree. Many of the Roman people adored Caesar, and the war against the conspirators would last for another few years. Today, if you want to see where Caesar was killed, you can in Rome. It's a place called the Largo Argentina. It was eventually transformed into a place with a number of different temples, but the original theater of Pompey, its foundations are still there. And actually, if you want to go into the old theater of Pompey where Caesar is killed, that's underground in the basement of one of the buildings that you see in the distance in this photo. It's today a restaurant, so you can go down and sit in the theater of Pompey and eat a pizza where Julius Caesar was killed. Today, though, that place, not only is it a restaurant, it's also a cat sanctuary. So you can go to Rome and adopt a cat, name it Caesar, right, and bring it home with you from the place where Julius Caesar was killed. Caesar, there we go. Caesar, you see him on this family tree. Caesar adopts his young nephew, a boy of about 16, 17 years old. When Caesar dies in the year 44, Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, who will be called Augustus, claims to be Caesar's heir. As Caesar's heir, Octavian Augustus is going to have a claim on Caesar's power, his wealth, his reputation, and his plans for the future. But whereas Julius Caesar maybe really was wanting to restore the Republic, Octavian Augustus, he says he wants to restore the Republic, but he never makes any steps to doing so. As we'll see, Caesar's heir, Octavian Augustus, is a brutal dictator, a brutal autocratic ruler who uses the power of propaganda to shape the people's opinions of him. And it still works today. His propaganda is so effective that a lot of people learning about Augustus Caesar, Octavian Augustus today, still look at him and are like, wow, he was a great guy. He wasn't. He was a monster. With Caesar dead, Octavian and his and Caesar's other heir, Marcus Antonius, are going to eventually fall into fighting themselves. Right? Another third civil war will break out. This period of Roman history is marked by just conflict after conflict after conflict. Civil war among the Romans for almost 50 years. Rome is consistently at war with itself. 50 years of civil strife. It's maybe no wonder then that when one strong ruler, right, Octavian Augustus, claims that he is the only one who can stop the fighting, that many of the Roman people simply say, whatever it takes to end the civil wars, we'll do it, even if they have to give up their freedom. This war between Caesar's heirs, between Octavian and Mark Antony, would carry on for another few years. Their fighting spreads throughout the Roman world again. Like the fighting between Caesar and the Senate, it is also decided in Greece. And this time, Octavian and Mark Antony fight at a place called Actium. It's a naval battle. Roman ships clashing with Roman ships. Octavian comes out ahead. He's the victor. And Antony and his ally, the last pharaoh of Egypt, a woman named Cleopatra, are defeated. When Antony is defeated and Cleopatra too, there is no one else in the way of Augustus and his claim to being, or Octavian, I should say, and his claim to being the heir to Caesar and the one who should control Rome. When he returns to Rome, the Senate, terrified of him, loyal, now basically his lapdogs, the Senate says that Octavian should have a new name, and they call him Augustus, which means the Holy One. We also see things like the reorganization of the calendar. The Roman calendar before Julius Caesar has 10 months. After him, it has the month of, you guessed it, July. And then the month of August is added. Julius for their family and August for Augustus, the Holy One, Augustus. They even changed the calendar to honor these men. Augustus now will be the first emperor. He is not a king. He doesn't call himself king, but he has all the powers of one. He takes all the legal authority from several different offices, including the office of consul and the protector of the plebeians, the tribune. He claims he is going to restore the republic, but in reality, he is gathering power for himself and his family alone. This is the Rome of the empire, a Rome that will be ruled by emperors and dynasties of their families for centuries to come. The Republic is well and truly dead after Augustus. No matter what he claimed about wanting to restore the Republic, he did not. Augustus does not call himself king. He doesn't even call himself emperor. He calls himself princeps, which you might notice is where we get the word prince. Princeps just means first citizen, chief citizen. He says, I am the first among equals. We're all citizens here. I'm just the first one. I'm just the chief one. He says, we're all equals. I'm just a little bit better than you. Under Augustus, we see the Senate lose a great deal of authority, but so too do those plebeian assemblies. Augustus begins to consolidate power for himself. He sets up a system where he decides who will be the next princeps, who will be the next one in charge, and it's inevitably going to be from his own family. Although Roman government changes, that empire that the Republic had built across Europe and the Mediterranean is largely at peace. If you lived within the borders of the Roman world and you were an obedient citizen, you could count on the Pax Romana, right? The Roman peace. For 2 centuries, the Roman government, the territory ruled by Rome is largely at peace. But outside its borders, the Roman Empire is a predatory nation state. It depends on war, enslavement, and subjugation of others to survive. The way the Roman Empire survives is by gobbling up the resources and the people outside its own borders. Everyone outside the Roman Empire was not just a threat, it was prey to the Roman Empire's ravenous appetites for slavery and for stuff. No one ever said the Romans were the good guys. Obviously, some of them were. Augustus also uses the power of propaganda to control the narrative of who he is, why he should be in charge. He says that Rome is going to return to a golden age, that he is the only one who can make things good. He is the only one who can return Rome to what it should be, a nostalgia for a previous age where things were good. And if only we can go back to those times where Rome was great. He promises that he is going to make Rome great again. He uses propaganda, both art and architecture, but also literature, public events, public speaking, to make his point known. One of the most famous examples of this propaganda is one that you have already seen, one that we read a bit of. It's the Aeneid, written by the poet Virgil. If you remember, we ended our last class talking about the Aeneid. And in the Aeneid, part of it, a large part of it actually, features Aeneas going to the underworld and receiving a vision of the future that Aeneas, this hero, this epic hero of the Romans, the vision that he sees of the future is of Rome under the rule of the Emperor Augustus. And it's a kind of history making, right? It's Augustus trying to shape what Roman myth was about and placing himself in it, placing himself and his power in it, saying, oh, Augustus should be in charge because Aeneas likes it. Aeneas approves of Augustus. It's reshaping the very foundational myths to support now this new ruler. It's a rather profound and it's like saying, well, putting a president, it's like rewriting history and saying, oh, George Washington approves of our modern president. That doesn't make any sense. Of course not. George Washington would never know who our presidents are. I mean, frankly, I think George Washington would be surprised at how many people live in this country. How many people live in California? Oh my God. Well, Aeneas is shown in the Aeneid as approving of Augustus and his changes he's making to Rome. Right? It's a bold piece of political propaganda. But this is the Roman Empire that is going to grow. Remember that as this empire grows, yes, it is impressive, but it grows because the Roman Empire is a predatory state. It grows and adds these territories to it because the Roman government, the Roman military is expanding. It's seeking new resources. It's seeking new populations to enslave. The Roman Empire survives and thrives because it exploits others. Right? That's what is built. This Roman Empire is built out of. It's built out of the blood and sweat of enslaved peoples. It's built out of stolen land. That's the story of the Roman Empire. When we pick up next time, we are going to talk about, not about this, we're going to talk about this. We're going to talk about one city in particular. We're going to go to a normal everyday city in the midst of the Roman Empire, a place called Pompeii. This is a view of Pompeii from the air. We're going to talk about Pompeii as it lived and Pompeii as it died. We'll talk about life and death in a normal Roman city, what life was like for an everyday Roman. I hope to see you then. Thanks.